Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, where today, in Season 05, Episode 04, we delve into Andrew Heywood's political theory. An introduction and ask, are the traditional pillars of political power truly crumbling in our interconnected world? That's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try and untangle some of the most foundational concepts from Heywood's really important work, sovereignty, the nation, and these fascinating challenges posed by transnationalism. These aren't just, abstract terms for academics.
Not all.
They're the very bedrock of how we understand political power, identity, the whole global order. And what's really intriguing now is how these ideas, centuries old, some of them, are facing just unprecedented pressure today.
Exactly. Our mission here is really to peel back the layers. Look at these core political ideas, understand their history, where they came from, how they shaped our world, and critically, how these big global trends are putting them under, immense pressure. We'll look at the arguments for and against their relevance today, aiming to give you a clearer, maybe more nuanced picture of what political power actually looks like here in the 21st century.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with sovereignty. It's a word thrown around constantly, but what does it really mean? Heywood traces it back to, 15th, 16th century Europe?
That's right. As the modern state started taking shape, consolidating power, pushing aside older authorities like the church or feudal lords.
And that's when this concept of sovereignty emerges, the claim to absolute and unrestricted authority within defined borders. And the key thing Heywood points out is how this gave politics a spatial character. Suddenly, borders and boundaries mattered, big time.
Yeah, it created that clear line, didn't it? Between domestic politics inside the border and international politics, how states deal with each other.
So internal order versus external relations.
Exactly. But what's fascinating here, and Heywood really digs into this, is that while the principle sounds simple, absolute power, it's actually quite complex under the surface. He makes this crucial distinction, first between the legal side of sovereignty, de jure authority.
Right to rule, basically.
The supreme legal right to command obedience, yeah. Think Jean Baudin, the sovereign, makes the laws but isn't bound by them, only maybe by God or natural law.
Okay, yeah.
But then there's political sovereignty, de facto power. This is about the actual, on-the-ground, unchallengeable political might. The monopoly on force, like Hobbes wrote about in Leviathan.
So the difference between having the right on paper and having the actual muscle to enforce it.
Precisely. Legal power is pretty hollow. Without real power, you need
Right.
police, courts, enforcement.
Yeah.
But concurrently, even raw political power, it tends to seek that mantle of legal authority. Even repressive states set up legal systems, however flawed, to legitimize themselves.
Right, they want that veneer of legitimacy. Okay, so that's the general idea. Let's zoom in on internal sovereignty. Where is that supreme power located within the state? That seems to have shifted dramatically over time.
Oh, massively. You go from absolute monarchs, like Louis XIV, literally saying, L'État, c'est moi, I am the state.
Can't get much clearer than that.
Nope. To, radical changes like Rousseau in the 18th century talking about popular sovereignty, the idea that ultimate authority lies with the people, the general will.
Big shift. And then you also get the idea of legislatures holding sovereignty, right? Like in Britain.
Yeah, John Austin's concept of the monarch in parliament, the idea that parliament has, or appeared to have, unlimited legal power to make or unmake any law.
But this raises a huge question, doesn't it? How well does that traditional idea of a single absolute sovereign power source actually fit modern governments, especially complex ones, democracies, federal states?
Exactly. Critics argue it's pretty outdated. Take a federal state like the USA. Power is explicitly divided between the federal government and the states. So where's the sovereignty? Is it the Constitution itself?
Or the Supreme Court interpreting it?
Or maybe the amendment process, that complex mechanism needing Congress and the states? Or maybe, ultimately, it's just we the people. It's not clear-cut, like that old model suggests.
Much messier. Unlike the UK, maybe, which seems simpler with parliamentary sovereignty because it doesn't have that single written constitution dividing powers in the same way.
Right, it seems simpler legally, but the political reality is always more complex. The key takeaway, maybe, is that the 16th century ideal of absolute singular power doesn't quite capture the reality of shared negotiated authority in most modern states.
Then the real world constantly throws up challenges anyway. Heywood points to the UK again. Its legal sovereignty was, undeniably compromised by membership of the European Union, wasn't it?
Absolutely. That Factortame case from 1991 is the classic example. EU law took precedence over an act of the UK Parliament. That directly challenged the traditional view of parliamentary sovereignty.
And even beyond the strictly legal stuff, Parliament's actual political power is limited, right? By voters, by devolved assemblies in Scotland and Wales, by big business, by international agreements.
Exactly. It's never truly absolute in practice. So moving outwards then to external sovereignty. This is about the state's position internationally, its independence from other states.
Where does that idea come from?
Its roots are often traced back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War in Europe. It basically established the principle that states are independent, autonomous actors on the world stage.
And that's still hugely important today.
Incredibly so. It's tied up with ideas of national independence, self-government. You see it playing out constantly. Think about the Arab-Israeli conflict, or when the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia broke apart in the early 90s. Those new republics were all asserting their sovereignty, their independence.
But external sovereignty has its critics, too. Heywood mentions sinister implications. What's that about?
Well, if a state has exclusive jurisdiction over its territory, meaning no outside interference, what's to stop it from mistreating its own citizens?
Yeah.
That absolute control could potentially shield governments engaging in, terrible human rights abuses.
Wow. Unchecked power internally, protected by external sovereignty.
That's the fear. And if you connect that to the bigger picture, the whole rise of human rights as an international concern and things like humanitarian intervention, well, they directly challenge that absolute external sovereignty.
Like NATO in Kosovo.
Oh.
Or Libya.
Precisely. Those interventions suggested that sometimes the international community might have a right or even a duty to intervene despite claims of sovereignty if massive human rights violations are happening. It's hugely controversial, of course.
And there's another twist, isn't there? The argument for sovereignty within a state is to prevent chaos?
Yeah, the Hobbesian idea. Without a sovereign, life is nasty, brutish, and short.
Could you apply that logic internationally to argue for some kind of global state to prevent anarchy between nations?
Paradoxically, yes. If you need a supreme authority internally to keep order, why wouldn't you need one internally to prevent war and chaos? It's a logical extension, but politically and practically, hugely problematic. And anyway, are states even truly externally sovereign in political reality? Power is so unevenly distributed.
You mean like during the Cold War? Or even now?
Yeah, the U.S. and Soviet Union were clearly in a different league. And even the U.S., post 9/11, faced immense challenges imposing its will in Iraq and Afghanistan. Real political sovereignty externally is maybe more limited than the legal principle suggests for many states.
Okay, so that's sovereignty complex, contested, maybe evolving. What about the other big pillar, the nation? For a long time, the nation-state, where the nation and the state boundaries match up, has been seen as the ideal, right? The most legitimate form of political rule.
For over 200 years, definitely. It's fueled nationalism, this incredibly powerful force, and the idea that every nation deserves its own state.
But again, let's clarify. What is a nation versus a state? People mix them up.
They do. A nation, Heywood explains, is primarily a cultural thing. It's a group of people who feel bound together maybe by shared language, religion, history, traditions. A state is the political apparatus, the government, the laws, the territory, the institutions.
So you can have nations without states and states with multiple nations.
Absolutely. Think of the Kurds, a nation spread across several states, or the UK itself, arguably containing English, Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish nations within one state. And while there are objective markers like language, ultimately, Heywood argues, nations are defined subjectively. It's about that shared national consciousness, that feeling of belonging, what Gellner called the aspiration to self-government.
Which is why it's often so contested, like Sikhs wanting Khalistan or Quebecois separatism or the SNP in Scotland.
Exactly. Where does one nation end and another begin? It's about identity. And Heywood also notes different types of nations, cultural nations, based on deep historical roots like the Greeks or Germans, versus political nations, forged more around shared civic principles, like maybe the USA or France. Each has strengths and weaknesses.
So what are the justifications for seeing the nation as so important? Why has national identity been such a powerful force?
Well, one argument is that it provides the surest basis for identity and solidarity. In a complex world, a nation can feel like an organic community, offering a sense of belonging, a higher loyalty that cuts across other divisions like class or region.
It feels natural, maybe.
For many, yes. And Gellner linked it to big socioeconomic shifts, like industrialization. As old local bonds weakened with people moving around more, nationalism offered a new kind of social solidarity, gluing together these larger, more mobile societies.
Interesting. And there's a link to freedom, too.
Yes, stemming from the French Revolution and Rousseau's ideas. National self-determination, the nation governing itself, came to be seen as a collective expression of individual freedom. The people, as the nation, should be sovereign.
And then there's this idea of the nation as an ethical community. What does that mean?
It suggests that sharing a culture, a language, a way of life fosters a deeper sense of moral concern among people. You feel a stronger obligation to help fellow nationals. This is seen as underpinning things like the welfare state. You're more willing to contribute to support others if you feel part of the same national community.
Like ethical nationalism.
Right. Michael Walzer talked about morality being locally based and thick. The idea is that our strongest moral ties are naturally to those closest to us, those who share our specific history and culture. We owe more to our own.
Okay, but nationalism, it obviously has a very controversial side, especially regarding peace and war. Heywood lays out two really contrasting views here.
Starkly contrasting, yeah. On one side, you have the liberal nationalist vision. Thinkers like Mazzini in Italy, Kant, later Woodrow Wilson after World War I. Their view was that a world of independent democratic nation-states would actually be peaceful.
How so?
Wilson, for example, blamed autocratic empires for WWI. He believed democratic nations, respecting the right of self-determination for others, would naturally respect each other and cooperate. Liberals often advocate for national interdependence through free trade and setting up international bodies like the League of Nations or the UN to manage disputes peacefully. It's a fundamentally optimistic view.
Okay, that's the optimistic take, but then there's the much darker face of nationalism.
Absolutely. Critics argue that liberal nationalism is naive, that it ignores the irrational bonds or tribalism that nationalism often involves. This inherent us versus them mentality, they say, breeds suspicion, rivalry, conflict.
Leading to things like imperialism or major wars.
That's the charge. Nationalism's drive for expansion, for proving superiority, is blamed for European imperialism and seen as a major cause of both world wars. This can escalate into national chauvinism, an aggressive belief in your nation's superiority, often fused with racism, like Nazi Aryanism, leading to horrific consequences. The argument is that maybe all nationalism, because it inherently prioritizes one group, contains at least the potential for aggression.
A pretty sobering thought. Which leads us nicely into the modern challenges transnationalism. How is this different from just international relations?
Good question. Internationalism is about relations between states or nations. Transnationalism, as Heywood uses it, refers to processes and connections that operate across or beyond state borders, often bypassing the state altogether. Think flows of money, information, people, cultural products.
Things that don't really respect borders.
Exactly. These flows can be so intense that they arguably fatally undermine that old, neat division between domestic and international affairs. They call into question the real significance of state borders and therefore the relevance of both sovereignty and the nation-state itself.
And this is often discussed under the umbrella of globalization, right?
Right. Globalization is kind of the big picture. Held and his colleagues defined it as that widening, intensifying, speeding up, and growing impact of worldwide interconnectedness. It's got multiple dimensions. There's economic globalization, the integrated global markets, instant financial transfers, the power of huge transnational corporations.
Money zipping around the globe, 247.
Pretty much. And then there's cultural globalization. This is often talked about in terms of homogenization. It's sort of flattening out of cultural differences, often linked to the spread of Western, particularly American, consumer culture. Think global brands, movies, music, sometimes called Coca-colonization.
Okay, so if borders are becoming less relevant and global flows are intensifying, what does this actually mean for those pillars of power we started with? Sovereignty and the state.
Well, the argument goes that globalization challenges the state's control over its own territory, what Heywood calls superterritoriality. Geography and borders seem less important. This leads some to claim that economic sovereignty is basically meaningless now, that we live in a borderless world, and states are being hollowed out, losing power upwards to global markets and downwards to regional forces.
Sounds pretty definitive. Is that the consensus?
Not entirely. Heywood cautions that the rhetoric of a borderless global economy can be taken too far. States are still really significant economic players. In fact, some states, like the U.S. or China, have been major drivers of globalization.
They haven't just been victims of it.
Exactly. And they still have tools. They cooperate through international bodies like the World Bank, the WTO, the IMF to set rules and manage the global economy. So states aren't powerless, but their role and strategies have definitely had to change. They're navigating, regulating maybe, rather than strictly controlling everything within their borders.
What about the nation side? You mentioned transnational communities and diasporas. How do they fit in?
They're another key challenge. These are groups whose identities and loyalties literally cut across national borders. Think of historic examples like the Jewish diaspora, or more recent ones formed by migration. Modern tech, cheap flights, the internet, mobile phones makes it much easier for people to maintain strong ties with their homeland and with others from their groups scattered around the world.
So your primary loyalty might not be to the country you physically live in.
It might be more complex, yeah.
Yeah.
This clearly challenges the ideal of the nation-state, where everyone within the borders shares one primary national identity.
Does this mean the nation is fading away, replaced by these global tribes?
Again, Heywood urges caution against overstating it. Firstly, the idea of perfectly homogeneous nations was always a bit of a myth. Most nations have always had internal diversity and cross-border links. Secondly, these transnational communities aren't always unified. They have their own internal divisions. And thirdly, it's debatable whether these non-territorial loyalties are as deep or stable as traditional national identities.
So it's more complicated than just nation fading, transnationalism rising.
Probably. It's more like an interaction. Transnationalism hasn't simply wiped out nationalism. Instead, they influence each other. You get hybrid identities, people juggling multiple affiliations. You get creolization, where cultures mix and create new forms rather than just one dominating.
This really brings us to the ethical dimension of it all. All this increased connection, globalization, it raises big moral questions, doesn't it?
Huge ones. It's led to a revival of interest in cosmopolitanism, ideas about global justice, a world ethics. The core idea is that maybe because we're all so interconnected, the world has become, in a sense, a single moral community. Our moral obligations shouldn't stop at our national borders.
What are the main ideas of this moral cosmopolitanism?
Heywood outlines three core tenets. First, individualism. Human beings, not states or nations, are the ultimate focus of moral concern. Second, egalitarianism. Every single human being deserves equal moral concern. Your nationality shouldn't matter morally. And third, universalism. Moral principles apply to everyone, everywhere. We're all, in a sense, citizens of the world.
Where do these ideas come from?
They have deep roots, drawing on thinkers like Kant with his idea of a universal duty of hospitality and also utilitarianism. The goal of reducing suffering globally suggests a one-world ethical perspective. This thinking is really the foundation for the modern doctrine of human rights, the idea that certain rights belong to everyone just by virtue of being human.
And that links back to things like global justice movements, humanitarian aid, even the responsibility to protect, idea justifying intervention.
Exactly. If everyone has equal moral worth, then maybe we have a duty to protect people elsewhere from extreme suffering or injustice, even if it means challenging national sovereignty.
It sounds like a compelling ethical vision for a globalized world. But like everything else we've discussed, it must have its critics.
Oh, definitely. Heywood points out several major challenges. One is cultural relativism. This argument says universal values are impossible, maybe even undesirable. Ideas like human rights, from this perspective, might just be Western values imposed on other cultures.
So morality is always local.
That's the claim. And related to that is the communitarian critique. This view holds that moral values only really make sense, only have force, when they're embedded within a specific community, a specific culture or nation. Communitarians often argue humans are naturally inclined to favor their own group, that thick morality we talked about earlier, which is stronger within the group than towards outsiders.
Makes sense intuitively, maybe. We care more about family than strangers.
That's the kind of intuition they draw on. And finally, there are big practical concerns. Is moral cosmopolitanism just wishful thinking? Can you actually uphold global justice without some kind of effective global institutions, maybe even a world government? And would such a government be desirable or even possible? Think about the risks: lack of democratic legitimacy, potential for tyranny.
Huge practical hurdles. So let's try and bring this all together. We started by asking if the traditional pillars sovereignty of the nation are crumbling. After digging into Heywood, what's the verdict?
Well, it's fascinatingly paradoxical. Despite all these pressures from globalization, transnational flows, cosmopolitan ideas, Heywood suggests the global age might actually be leading to a revival of nationalism in some ways, not its simple decline.
A revival, how so?
You see it in the rise of ethnic nationalism after the Cold War, in populist movements reacting against immigration and globalization across the West, even in big modernization projects in countries like China or Russia, where nationalism is often part of the state-building narrative. It seems the more interconnected the world becomes, the more some people cling to national identity for security and meaning.
So the pillars aren't just crumbling away.
It seems not entirely. They're definitely under immense pressure. They're changing. Their meaning is being debated and reshaped constantly. Sovereignty is becoming more pooled, more conditional perhaps. National identity is interacting with other identities. But are they disappearing? Heywood seems to suggest they're transforming, adapting, maybe even pushing back, rather than simply fading into history. The story isn't over.
What a journey we've taken today. We've really taken a deep dive into Andrew Heywood's political theory, an introduction, haven't we? We've looked at sovereignty, the nation, their origins, how they're justified, and then grappled with these huge challenges from globalization and transnationalism. It's clear these pillars are under serious pressure, leading to some really complex, often contradictory debates about where we're heading.
Absolutely. And that leads us to a final, maybe provocative thought for you, our listener, to chew on. In a world where global connections just keep accelerating, where information and people move faster than ever, but at the same time, national identities and loyalties often seem fiercely defended, maybe even hardening, how might you start to think about balancing your own local or national identity with a wider, perhaps global sense of responsibility? What does it really mean, in practical terms, to be a citizen of the world today, while still being rooted in a particular place, a particular nation?
Powerful questions indeed. Something for us all to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into political theory. We really hope it sparks some thoughts, and we encourage you to keep exploring these complex ideas, maybe even check out Heywood's book for yourself. Until our next deep dive, take care.